Mothers have always held such symbolic weight in determining a person's worth. Your mother tongue, your motherland, your mother's values, these things can qualify or disqualify you from attaining myriad American dreams: love, fluency, citizenship, legitimacy, acceptance, success, freedom. Sour Heart is a collection of 7 linked short stories narrated by young Chinese-American girls living in New York City in the 90s. It's exceptionally hard to describe what I've written without sounding delusional or boring, so I'll just say they are stories about growing up and the pleasures and agonies of having a family, a body, and a home. One of the founding tenets of racism, a society that will never allow white people to think that because they are white, they won't succeed. I lived so completely in my mind, a place of unchecked delusion and complete fantasy. Asian American success is often presented as something of a horror: robotic, unfeeling machines psychotically hell-bent on excelling, products of abusive tiger parenting who care only about test scores and perfection, driven to succeed without even knowing why. I went to school in California, at Stanford when I was 17, and I lived in San Francisco until I was 23, and then I lived in Hungary for, like, a summer, and then I went to Iowa for 3 years. At Iowa, I actually did the fiction program, not poetry. I was a fiction writer for a long time before I was out as a poet. When I was a graduate student at the Iowa Writers' Workshop for fiction writing, I felt both coveted and hated. My white classmates never failed to remind me that I was more fortunate than they were at this particular juncture in American literature. Growing up in America, I experienced 2 puberties. The first opened me up to the possibilities of adulthood. The second reinforced that for someone like me, an immigrant, a minority, an Asian American, there were limits. The year my mom worked as a secretary at an apparel company in Midtown, she would often come home in tears because she had mistakenly called her boss by another coworker's name. "You know how it is," my father said, "they all look the same. It's not your mom's fault. There's just no telling them apart. Same high nose and deep-set eyes." I think it was really important for me before I debuted myself in front of the world to have a private life with my imagination and my writing for several years. That also made it so I didn't feel desperate for someone to find me. Even when I speak English to my parents, I'll say an English word differently to my Chinese parents and friends than I do to my English-speaking friends. You know, I'll pronounce McDonald's differently, because it feels right, and that's what I'm used to. Alphabet, by the late Danish poet Inger Christensen. It's a book-length abecedarian poem. It's an activist text but also a portal to wonder. When I was writing stories about Chinese American characters in my fiction classes, I'd get comments like, "You should consider writing more universal stories." But anything can happen to a Chinese American girl, just as much of the canon of English literature involves white men or women. When I first moved from Shanghai when I was 5, I just thought of myself as Chinese. I grew up in a Chinese-American enclave where the person who lived down the street had literally lived down the street from my mother in Shanghai. As I got older, I realized that people saw me as other things, sometimes Korean, sometimes Japanese, sometimes just Asian. When my family moved to a more affluent white neighborhood, I started to see myself as other, this amorphous category. I didn't even know what not other was, but I knew I wasn't it. I wasn't what was normal. I'd behave savagely if I had access to Jerk's closet. Shanghai, the city where I was born and spent my first 4.5 years. It's not necessarily the most pleasant or most comforting place, but I have blood memory there, my core was formed there, so I need to go back often, or else I become empty, lost, without meaning. Growing up, I had to cobble together a scarecrow of things I loved from various different writers. I think Lena Dunham, the public figure, is, I hate the word brand, but I'm going to use it. It's such a brand that is so tethered to her public persona and to girls, but also this progressive politics that she's been more vocal about. Of course I want the things I write to reflect well on me or anyone who might feel represented by me, but also, I'm not writing a guidebook on how to be or how my people should be seen. I'm telling very specific stories. I seem to be drawn to these smaller forms, and I seem to be drawn to things that can be written and also read in one sitting. There's so much of our behavior that kind of curdles and hardens as we get into adulthood, and it becomes so much more difficult to be hopeful and to dream extravagantly. From its very inception, Lenny Letter set out to create a supportive, positive, inclusive space on the internet that does not shy away from complexity and nuance. Lena Dunham and Jenny Connor, who founded Lenny Books together, also happen to have exquisite reading tastes, from obscure small press poetry chapbook to dishy memoirs to literary novels, and so it's a real honor that they've chosen to announce their imprint with my stories. Growing up, I had a face that people wanted to tell things to, and I grew up with adults who had so much to say. They had lived through decades of unbelievable poverty, starvation, political upheaval, chaos. Chinese people of my parents' generation who lived through the Cultural Revolution knew so much of death at such a young age, and the psychic toll those experiences left was immense. I knew the stories of the Cultural Revolution before knowing what the Cultural Revolution was. I often wonder if my being a fairly small Asian woman with a high-pitched quietish voice plays a role in how often men feel entitled to come up to me and tell me, "You have this dull act," or whatever. It's okay if someone is disgusted or offended by my performance. It's just a performance. I hadn't ever worked with an editor until I was 26, although that could be partly chalked up to the MFA versus NYC thing, where I came up through institutions that encouraged writers to write privately for a long time and not sully themselves with concerns about audience or the business side of writing. Once I decided I was happy with something, I'd try to send it off into the world, and either someone would want it exactly as it was, or it would remain in my notebook/laptop, and no one would ever see it. This is probably why I didn't work with an editor until I was 26. The solipsism. If you were to make a quick judgment call on my intelligence and articulation when I first moved to the US based on my speaking skills, it would be very low. People who have very devastating lives sometimes have the most wild, avant-garde humor. It's like when you've seen it all and been through it all, nothing is off-limits in a way. We're not the best about knowing what's the most interesting about ourselves. I really had to develop a core. I had to figure out, at my core as a writer, what did I value, what was I about, and I had to love it and take pleasure in it. White people have always slipped in and out of the experiences of people of color and been praised extravagantly for it. My mother had two unshakable beliefs that she tried to drill into me. The first was that I had to study and work twice as hard as my white peers if I wanted to survive in America, and the second was that it was delusional and dangerous to believe I possessed the same freedom white people had to pursue my dreams. My privileged upbringing, education and linguistic fluency gave me such proximity to whiteness that it stung all the more to still find myself outside of it. My mother, on the other hand, not only accepted that she would always be an outsider in this country but also believed it to be a finer fate and home than any other she could have had. When it comes to love, maturity often gets a bad rap. Second love is boring, it's practical. It's what our parents feel for each other. Whenever I passed by a Chinese restaurant in a car, I'd joke to my friends, "Oh yeah, my uncle owns that place." For a decade, Emily Moss has been steadily making weird, moody, melancholic music under the moniker Emmy the Great that has been referred to as new folk, anti-folk, synth-pop, and, most of all, literary. I like to keep a book underneath the pillow that I'm not sleeping on so I can reach over and grab it when I wake up. I don't always do that, but I like to. I try to make sure it's a book and not my laptop. I also try not to get too excited about who might have been trying to contact me while I was asleep. It's like a weird mindset to wake up and want to be wanted. Like, I want to be wanted so much already, and I'm so greedy for other people's desire that I have to really force myself to have some shame about it and some control, neither of which come easily to me. We lived in one of those half-basement apartments, and on our first night of being in America, someone reached through the grate that protects the window and stole our laundry detergent, which wasn't a big deal, but it felt symbolic when I heard about it later as an adult. When I was an undergrad at Stanford, there was a girl named Jenny Kim who worked for the school newspaper. Sometimes people would come up to me and talk to me about articles she had written. That one on getting a Brazilian was hilarious, some guy said, high-fiving me. I know I am not the first woman to ask this, but how can I be both damaged and lovable? How do I become the protagonist of a story? As a child, I would go days without speaking, and then suddenly I would scream until everyone was looking at me. I just submitted what I had to the Octopus Books Contest open reading period, and they said they wanted to publish my poetry book. Then I started to publish more and more poetry because people would ask me to do readings or ask me submit something for their journal. Poetry was my dirty little secret when I was a fiction writer at Iowa, and then fiction became my dirty little secret when I started writing more poetry and working for Rookie. With non-fiction, I had to learn how to be a clear communicator, but it was also a relief to be able to articulate some of my political ideas and beliefs. I also try to do that in my fiction, but I'm more interested in asking questions that lead to more questions, mysteries that lead to more mysteries, rather than immediate answers and solutions. Visit our website for more quotes, quoting.com.